So I bought new books, right? I guess mainly aimed at like Imperial theology, right? I don't know, I felt like ever since like my problems with Orthodox Christology, like it ties into the cult of the emperor, right? The religion, the Imperial theology, or something like that. Sorry, I'm just like tired a little bit. But I wanted to read a little bit from this book, Eastern Christianity and its Texts. Sorry, it's called Eastern Christianity and its Texts by Cyril Halperin, right? It's a very good book. It's got a lot of stuff in it. I was on this part on isms, right? Byzantinism, Orthodoxism, and traditionalism, right? And I read this because like I listen to like a lot of Christian nationalists, and I see like I'm seeing like some of them like I don't know, some of them Orthodox, but then it's like okay, but you know, like based on some of them, not all of them, mainly the apologists online, they like from the Orthodox tradition like to promote the idea of monarchy and all this other craziness, and Byzantium, right? Like they romanticize Byzantium and have a book that kind of is polemical a little bit against that. Shows that how basically Orthodox sort of, at least based on briefly what I've read right from it, that Orthodox Christians romanticize Byzantium, right? And in this book it talks about Byzantine nationalists, right? I don't know, like here is in the context of some Romanian theologian named Nichifor Kranic, 1889 through 1972. I don't know, it's just like articulated the basics of the fascist and semi-fascist ideologies which some Orthodox churches embraced during the 20th century. And he says like there is a revival of such ideologies in the 21st century that have become known under the umbrella name of Orthodoxism. He says, quote, Orthodoxism, end quote. Orthodoxisms usually consist of two ingredients, Byzantinism and nationalism. Such a combination per se and peculiar. Byzantium was a multinational entity and as such incompatible with the ethnic exclusivism of modern nationalist ideologies. Nevertheless, Orthodox ideologues such as Kranic managed to pack Byzantianism and nationalism into a single ideology, close to fascism and Nazism. And it says here, a great river of Orientalism then flowed into the riverbed of our people's soul. Byzantium and Kiev took their toll. As it passed by, flowed underneath Orthodoxy, that import which in time developed into the reservoir of our primitive focus. Orthodoxy thus forms part of our people's wealth and constitutes yet a power by which our patriarchal mentality, our native genius, differentiates itself from and resists the currents of European civilization, so fresh in their historical origin. Kranic, 1924. It's the combination of Byzantianism and nationalism amplified anti-Semitism in some Orthodox countries, especially during the interwar period. Most conservative Orthodox public thinkers in the period before the Holocaust were openly anti-Semitic. Kranic, for instance, went as far as arguing that Jesus Christ could not be a Jew. It says, he described the clash between the liberal and conservative factions in the contemporary society as a, quote, war of the Talmud against the gospel of Christ, end quote. He says, Europe today is not stirred by a simple social war, nor by an ideological war. Today, Europe is stirred by the war of the Talmud against the gospel of Christ, the democratic regime of the last century, its unlimited liberties and paroxysm of third world peace has given the Jewish people an insane courage and the messianic frenzy of the white horse. Since the French Revolution, Judaism has won success after success, and its progressive domination in the world is blinding it to its limitations. However, these excesses of immoderate people would be the downfall of Judaism. This is Krennic, 1997. This is Krennic called himself and his Confederates, quote, traditionalist, end quote. Traditionalism has become another face of the same ideology of Byzantinism, Orthodoxism. The Orthodox churches during the 20th century endorsed fascist regimes in their own and other countries because these regimes appealed to traditional values. The problem of traditionalism, in addition to legitimizing dictatorships, is that it substitutes the tradition in the sense of revelation being transmitted to and through the church with the idolatrous veneration of the past. It is usually selective about what exactly in the past it wants to worship. The criteria for such selection are often shaped by ideological conservatism, which many Eastern Christians confuse with orthodoxy. And then this other chapter talks about Eastern Christianity and communism. And then this goes into that, but that's what it says here at the end over here, right? What traditionalism, right? Because I know, like, a lot of the right say, like, that America needs more traditional values, right? But then I see the way these young American converts, right? Like the way they convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, right? And then it's like I'm not trying to be like mean, right? But I watch their apologists online, like a lot of them. They're all kind of young, right? Like in their 20s or something, and they're all like the arguments are so bad. Like, I'm not saying they're dumb, right? But I'm saying, like, it's a form of tardation. Like, all of the arguments of why orthodoxy is true is based on fallacies. Like, because, what was the one? Like, the appeals to early beliefs, right? Early church beliefs. The appeals to popular beliefs. The appeals to traditional beliefs or beliefs based on authority, right? Because the church says it's true, therefore it's true, right? And none of which prove anything. It doesn't prove anything is true, right? Just you and your presuppositions, right? And it's possible that you believe in false presuppositions, and so, because, like, I watch how they try to use these arguments against more learned Muslims and more learned Protestants, right? They catch on that these are just fallacies and they're not proving anything, right? And it's abysmally bad. And then, and then I found these other books I want to talk about. This one's called Christianity and the Rhetoric of Empire, the Development of Christian Discourse, right? It looks like this. This is by Everett Cameron, right? And in it, from what I've read, it talks about how, like, your rhetoric, your use of language, right, and all that, after Constantine and all that, like, it's utilized to develop a closed system, right? Like, your constant repetition of theological formulas and creeds and your rhetoric all formulates a closed system of, like, some form of, like, Christian rhetoric and discourse. Like, you develop your own language, your own way of thinking, your own distinctions, right? And this is kind of what I see in your Christology. It's like, these are just words, right? Because I watch Fearless Truth, right? And he gives the same typical answers, right, that he gets from the saints and from the traditionalists, right? And it comes to the hypostatic union, the day and the hour. And I'm like, these people just don't get it. Like, it's not possible to prove that God via, right, the Son via, like, if he's God, if through a union he can experience human nature, but you won't even grant him his human ignorance, right? So it's possible that because he, like, when it comes to the day and the hour, because I also have a book similar, a book on that, right? The Christological controversies in the 7th century, I think it was, from the same author, Cyril of Hoveron. I don't think they understand. Like if you're going to say that Jesus knows the day of the hour because he's like God in the same way that the Father is God, right? Then you are basically saying, just like the Father being God, he cannot know human ignorance. And so this is why when you say the statement that, God, the divine person, like the Son of God, the divine person, pertain to his human, nature, this is this is a true statement or something, right? Like, I'm sorry, I'm still trying to wake up, but no, I just feel like you are admitting that because he's God, in the same sense that the Father is God, right? That he cannot know human ignorance, and so this is why it's reduced to a figure of speech when he says things like he doesn't know, right? Doesn't know something. But listen to every excuse they make on that Christological issue, right? On the God-man thing, when you apply it to the Bible, you see how inconsistent it is. And you literally have to presuppose things that deny the very thing that you say, right? Like he is a true man according to his human nature, but not pertaining to his divinity, but is the same person, right? And that's why I told you repeatedly that you're speaking about the same person in two contradictory senses, and that's why it's not okay for you to say that one person pertains to two natures. Like that is what solves the contradiction. I said no, it doesn't, because the split happens in the union of the two natures in a single person. The split happens in the person. That's where the split happens. And so you create two persons out of one person and two natures. And so that's why I said that you either believe he's God or he's both, and it's not both, because God is God. God is not both God and man, even in the union, right? He either remains God, which a lot of heresies from that, right? If he just remains God, he's just God and not man, but you'll describe him as a man pertaining to the flesh, which is, again, like this book, right? I'm assuming that's what that means, right? Rhetoric. That all of that is not actually true. It's actually very, I would say it's a false statement that God pertaining to his human nature can die. It's a false statement. Divine person is not, what was the thing? There's three ways you can bring up three things that they define: human death, human person, and God. All in the union. And so God does not experience what is proper to a man, which is a separation of human properties, right? Which is how you define a human person, which is nature with properties. And body and soul is human properties within the human person. That is what makes up a human person, right? And from what I remember, St. Maximus the Confessor says this. Was it Dionysius or Damascus, right? John Damascus and some other saints, and then the Sixth Ecumenical Council, one of the sessions, I think, the one that's against Eutychus, right? They say that the person is basically nothing more than nature with properties, right? Also remember seeing all this from Jonathan Hill's channel, right? His video, he's Orthodox, and he shows that it's not wrong to describe a person as nature with properties. And so logically in the union, right, divine person pertaining to his human nature does not experience human properties, and so that is only a figure of speech. And so you can apply that to his human ignorance, to his human passions, to his human death. It literally undermines and destroys the whole thing of salvation, even theosis, right? It's not even possible, because he's not an actual man, but is rhetorically spoken of as a man, right? That's what the rhetoric is, right? Because I remember what the Lord showed me, that you deceive with your mouth, that you're not actually. None of it can be demonstrated to be true, but it can be demonstrated to be false. This is what some of these Protestants that adopt this way of thinking, right? And it's just not true. And then they adopt certain councils, right? They adopt certain councils, like the first, that do the Christology, the first three or whatever, I don't remember. And they think it's because it's biblical, and then they think they can count themselves as Nicene Christians, right? And this kind of ties into the religion of the Imperium, the religion of the Emperor, the Empire, the Christ cult of the Emperor, and stuff like that. But it's not like the reason why you cannot count yourself as one of them is because when you ask them, well, why do you accept the Nicene Creed, right? And a lot of them will say because it's biblical, right? So you get it from the Bible, right? But it's no, you have to believe in the God Emperor, right? The magisterial imperial tradition, right? You have to believe the same way, think the same way, not just mean the same things, right? Confess the same creeds. You have to think the same way. It's because you believe the magisterium is infallible, and you believe you see the scriptures in light of the church, according to the mind of the church, in light of the Imperium, right? Which ties into the God Emperor who calls councils is just as much part of that system. and so is the Imperial creeds and all that, right? And it shows like through all of that, you formulate your own worldview, right? And then go by your own definitions. This is why, like, to you, you're not committing heresy, but in reality, you are. Like when I showed you that Christology is so utterly heretical and blasphemous, right? But to them, because of Orthodox tradition, how they define things, in their mind, they're not committing heresy because the church says you're not, right? And I said, no, you can demonstrate it, that you indeed are, right? That you fall into your own errors, like you try to hold the two natures consistent in a person, creates a contradictory person that doesn't exist. And they'll say, this is not heresy, this is proper, this is a mystery, right? No matter how many ways there's so many ways to disprove that Christology. The reason why I attack it is because it is like the heart and soul of your Imperial theology. And I know that it destroys your religion, that's why I attack it, but I'm not trying to destroy your religion, I'm trying to liberate the mind of the church from the Imperium, because I don't believe you need that. Jesus says, upon this rock I built my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And absolutely no emperor is involved. They don't have the consciousness of ecumene, that they have to seek approval of the empire. There was no such thing. And I have other books here that actually, I found these other books that agree, but I don't want to get into that yet. That agree with the idea of resistance to that kind of religion, right? But let me just read from this book a little bit, just bits and pieces. Like here, like basically what the book is about. It says, clearly this book is not written from the materialist point of view. It is not concerned with the economic or institutional structure of the church as such, and does not consider Christianization in relation to the development of an institution or set of institutions. It is not, therefore, either a study of the economic and political dimensions of Christian faith or of its, quote, structural role, end quote, in Roman imperial society, though naturally these aspects are interconnected. Rather, it looks at a particular element in the establishment of Christian belief and at the relation between Christian modes of expression and those prevailing in a general cultural context. There is much more to the advance of a faith like Christianity than its social and institutional structures may reveal, just as there is more to the understanding of the rise of celibacy as a Christian practice than can be seen from the development of organized monasticism. However, much can be learned about Christianization from a study of its social and economic practices and of the implications of its growth on contemporary social organization. We must account for the fact that it did, in fact, establish itself in the hearts and minds of the people. Here it says, Antony's exchange with his pagan critics goes to the heart of the matter. I'm not sure which Antony is talking about. Maybe St. Anthony, maybe? It says, quote, since of course you pin your faith on demonstrative proofs, and this is an art in which you are masters, and you want us also not to worship God without demonstrative arguments, do you first tell me this? How does precise knowledge of things come about, especially knowledge about God? Is it by verbal proof or by an act of faith? And which comes first, an act of faith or verbal proof? End quote. When they replied that the act of faith takes precedence and that this constitutes accurate knowledge, Antony said, quote, well said, faith arises from the disposition of the soul, while dialectic comes from the skill of those who devised it. Accordingly, those who are equipped with an act of faith have no need of verbal argument, and probably find it even superfluous. For what we apprehend by faith that you attempt to construct by arguments, and often you cannot even express what we perceive. The conclusion is that an act of faith is better and stronger than your sophistic arguments, end quote. There is of course an element of disingenuousness in this familiar argument. For rhetoric, the strategies of discourse was itself one of the many technologies by which early Christianity implanted, quote, habits of the heart, end quote, more powerful than institutions and more lasting than social welfare. Subjectivity lurks in every part of our topic, while historians are readily criticized if they show sympathy for Christianity. New Testament scholars will not only admit but actually demand personal engagement with the subject, or even voice actual suspicion of, quote, the historical method, end quote. But perhaps now when one affect of the present awareness of the importance of texts is to break down the barriers between different kinds of academic writing. We have more chance than previously to avoid either extreme. And talks about, the next section is about Christianity and communication. Let me just read it briefly. It says, but if the subject of Christianity still invites an undertext, so does that of rhetoric. Quote, mere rhetoric, end quote, the phrase speaks for itself. Admittedly, the new fashion for rhetoric should have reversed the situation, but in the context of Roman Imperial literature, rhetoric has yet to find a sympathetic modern champion, and rhetoric and Christianity together are apt to evoke a pained recoil. So the one I've read, I only read a little bit. I guess like what it's talking about, like, yeah, like how can you utilize the idea, right, of the rhetoric, that imperial frame of the Christian empire, how it can be utilized to like go against rival worldviews or something. But overall, it was pretty interesting, like at least from the first part that I read. But I want to read you this part to give you an idea of what it's talking about. Sorry, I don't want to get lost in the idea. No, I don't want to get lost reading the book, but it's talking about Mary. It says, the figure of Mary in the early Christian period underwent development in two main directions. This is in the chapter of, this chapter called Stories People Want. And it says that Mary in the early Christian period underwent development in two main directions, both evident as early as the 2nd century, and typical of the progress of Christian discourse. First, her fundamental role in the doctrinal implications, and the doctrinal implications of the story of the incarnation of Christ were steadily explored and defined from Justin and Irenaeus on. Second, the stories about Mary, which were so influential and widely known from at least the 2nd century, bypassed the practical questions of church order and orthodoxy by their very human and imaginative appeal, and were central in the evolution of a mental world of narrative and story in which an explanation could be found for any awkwardness, however difficult. And their variation over the centuries, they show the remarkable tenacity and elasticity of Christian discourse and its capacity to adapt to any social conditions. And in this early Christian world, although there were already strong impulses towards control of the discourse, there were also, as we can see from the case of the apocryphal Acts, considerable advantages in variety and multiplicity. It is clear that the Acts did not develop in isolation in a happy phrase. Thomas Hagg has referred to their literary landscape as, quote, covered by a dense, almost impenetrable vegetation, end quote. It is just this obscurity that it makes it so difficult to relate them to secular literature or indeed oral stories. He talks about primitive Catholicism, agnosticism, and stuff like that, and then goes over Christian writing and Christian literature. Anyway, this is what I picked up this book for, to understand like how to utilize rhetoric in favor of in your theology in light of your Christ quote of the emperors or whatever. And in this book, sorry, I forgot to show the book. This one's called The Byzantine Republic, People and Power in New Rome, by Anthony Caldelis. He looks like this. Sometimes I'm trying to wake up. Yeah, this is basically like what I was talking about. I found this book and it just challenges the idea. Like, it's a revisionist book because it takes a different perspective on Byzantium or whatever. Like, it frames it more of like a republic because of like it was basically, when I was reading from the preface, it was basically saying like how the idea of the God Emperor and divine right of kings, right, is not actually accurate. It's more of a romanticized view. And then what other stuff? Let me see. Where was I? Like here, I guess, in the preface, right? I was reading. It says the politia as a political sphere reflected the consensus of the Roman people that operated in a conceptual space that encompassed both the emperor and the community of whom he was the emperor. The importance of this concept should not be underestimated for the Byzantine view of politics, and yet it is entirely missing from our representation of their culture. This book seeks to restore, quote, the mental map by which individuals orientated themselves. Sorry, I had to step away. And like I was saying, the politia as a political sphere reflected the consensus of the Roman people that operated in a conceptual space that encompassed both the emperor and the community of whom he was the emperor. The importance of this concept should not be underestimated for the Byzantine view of politics, and yet it is entirely missing from our representation of their culture. This book seeks to restore, quote, the mental map of which individuals oriented themselves politically, end quote, first by revealing the logic about politics that pervades Byzantine texts in many genres, especially legal texts, military treatises, historiography, and others. Each of these presents and discusses the same core ideas, albeit from a different viewpoint, which enables us to form a rounded picture and to consider the interests of different parties within it. After considering first the ideological framework, I will turn to the politia as a historical entity in action in chapter 5, and only in the final chapter, chapter 6, will the interaction of Roman and Christian ideologies be considered. For I will argue that we have so far taken to be definitive of the political sphere. The theocratic imperial idea was an attempt by the court to ameliorate rhetorically the vulnerable position in which it found itself always in managing a turbulent republic. Most of this book will, therefore, be devoted to presenting the latter model on its own terms, to see what political phenomena and discourses we can explain by it. Only at the end will I step back to consider the broader concept of multiple discourses of power in Byzantium. While the politia has been effaced in the scholarship, it is pervasive in the sources. For this reason, I cite many quotations from the sources and place the Greek in the notes and sometimes in the texts. I use the transliterated form politia when discussing the contents of a particular source, but sometimes use the form, quote, polity, end quote. In my own exposition, I often use the closest direct translation, quote, republic, end quote, for reasons that will become clear, as an English word, quote, polity, end quote, does not carry the baggage of, quote, commonwealth, end quote, complicated by the British Commonwealth and Opolinsky's fictitious Byzantine Commonwealth, both worlds apart from what politia meant. Nor does politia mean state, which is how it is often translated, with consequences that are sometimes disastrous. Empire is another confusing term, which also has been inadequately theorized. By, quote, empire, end quote, in relation to Byzantium, I mean that it was governed by a ruler whom we conventionally call an emperor, in effect a monarch, the basileus of the Romans. In other words, in my usage, empire means monarchy, and I remain provisionally skeptical of other senses that are attributed to the word by scholars. For example, an alternative would be to call it an empire because it exerted imperial dominion over non-Romans, which at times it did, but this poses the danger of sliding into the concept of the multi-ethnic empire, about which I am skeptical in the case of Byzantium. The latter is a misleading concept that intentionally or not disintegrates and elides the Roman homogeny of the vast majority of the population of quote, empire, end quote. It is unfortunate that we use the same term to refer to such different aspects, namely having an quote, emperor, end quote, and being an multi-ethnic empire, which did not always coincide. They did coincide in the early Roman Empire, where our terms, quote, imperium, end quote, and quote, imperator, end quote, originate, but less so in Byzantium. These are issues that I will explore more fully in the sequel to the study. It says, as this book will present a Byzantium considerably different from what is found in most surveys and specialized studies, the argument must be presented in steps. Not every lateral problem can be identified and examined at each step, for that would break up the exposition and create many digressions, some of which are separate topics in their own right. I hope that the general concerns of each reader are addressed at a later point in the argument, but I know that it will not be possible to cover everything at first. It talks about like some core notions of Byzantium. So these core notions of ours about Byzantium, however, were not established by rigorous scholarly methods to begin with. Were never actually, quote, proven, end quote, and have not been subjected to critical scrutiny in modern times. Some, including the denial of the Byzantine Roman identity, have been handed down to us from ages before the emergence of academic scholarship, and their origins are linked to political and religious interests that we would disown as historians. If only we knew of them. It is my hope that while we have grown comfortable with these notions, we also have no personal stake in them. From many experiences at conferences, I gained the sense that the field is ready to begin exploring the Roman dimensions of Byzantium, to move past the horror of the Roman name and the, quote, obsession and single-minded focus on Christianity, end quote. And it talks about like the course of this book. He cites exponents of views with which he disagrees, and that most of those views are pervasive, so pervasive that they could be illustrated from dozens of or hundreds of modern publications. Basically, the position is that everyone held in the field at one point or another, even himself, right? So what else? So this argument in this book, he draws it from the late 5th century to 12th century. It says the starting point is marked by the settling of the emperors in Constantinople and the dynamic resumption of populist republican norms after the intermission of internet military rule that started in the 3rd century. So the argument could have been based on material from the Middle Byzantine period alone, but I wanted to show how these traditions were anchored in Roman late antiquity. As Walter Kagi pointed out, quote, the reluctance of many scholars to combine their investigations of the 7th and 8th centuries with researches on the 5th and 6th centuries has contributed to an unnecessary obfuscation of many topics, end quote. It says, I'm not arguing that the Byzantine Republic appeared suddenly in the 5th century and then just as suddenly disappeared when the Crusaders destroyed it. Its history actually extends back into the Roman Republic forward to 1453, Aspects of that long trajectory will be presented along the way. History did not unfold always according to academic boundaries, but extending the argument fully in those two directions would complicate it unnecessarily. It would require further discussions if of its messy rise and fall. He says that there is enough to work with in the period from 500 to 1200, or 1200. So he's trying to identify the changes that can be identified and interpreted. It says, given past views of the culture as locked in timeless decadence, Byzantinists have understandably embraced the slogan of change, but sometimes it seems to be for its own sake. Byzantium was a remarkably coherent society. We take for granted how easy it is to recognize and source record and forget how tied its culture and society were to a specific political order. What I'm looking for are precisely the basic parameters of that identity and continuity, and these, I maintain, changed little over time. Lack of change on this fundamental level used to be taken as a sign of permanent decadence, but I take it as proof of dynamic stability and a source of strength. He talks about introducing the Byzantine Republic. He talks about the term political ideology. Talks about the emperor was appointed to rule by God and had a responsibility to imitate or obey God in his manner of rule. And it says almost no Byzantinists, however, explain what they mean by the word, quote, ideology, end quote, or situated within a specific theoretical approach. This is that usually the term means a basic set of beliefs is used to mean that. That's what it's used for, I guess. It's an assumption that most people in the empire held these beliefs. So on the assumption that most people in the empire held these beliefs and thus tacitly consented to the imperial system, but no one has yet proven that, or in what way the population accepted their theocratic notions of court literature, nor has any methodology been devised for generating such proof. And it says that this book is meant as a contribution to the study of Byzantine political ideology. Indeed, it approaches the topic for the first time as an open question and not as a settled set of assumptions on which future research can safely be built. Because I get these books because it's talking about, like, okay, what do I even know about Byzantium, right? So that's why I buy these books, right? To try to understand, like, where you're coming from. But no, America's not Byzantium. Like, as a Christian nation, I mean, I already showed you how America is Christian. It's like totally not this. With the established church, the God Emperor, right? Like, America has very anti-monarchy in spirit. It's based on the dissenting Protestant consciousness, and you could say that its liberalism is based on Lockean Christianity. And so that's why I make, like, the YouTube short on the founders, right? How they view the Constitution. It's like they saw it as divine, as a work of God or something, or like a divine assistance or so. It's not just a piece of paper, and then I upload a video on the Treaty of Tripoli to show that that's compatible with a dissenting Christian nation, because it doesn't in any sense define its Christian nation based on a national institution called a church or an imperial church, right? Unified to a national government or anything, like the way it was in history or so. And so all that is very important. I think is meant to safeguard you from this old tyranny and stuff like that. Like here, in this opening chapter, it says things like, This is first, our current version of imperial ideology focuses almost exclusively on the emperor and has little to say about the terms that define his relationship with his subjects. And that relationship is not theorized. It is treated pragmatically as the operation of largely coercive institutions. Most studies that purport to talk about, quote, imperial ideology, end quote, really mean ideology about the emperor, as if he were the only political entity of consequence. They do not mean ideology about how Byzantine political society was supposed to operate. The notion that, quote, the person of the emperor was the embodiment of Byzantine ideology, end quote, is fairly uncontroversial, but is doubly wrong. It was not the person that mattered as much as the office, and the office hardly exhausted the reach and content of Byzantine political ideology. The Byzantines had a sophisticated ideological ontology that placed the office into a particular kind of relation with the rest of the society, of which they also had a specific, distinctly Roman view. But this is invisible in the most modern accounts, which are biased in favor of the most theological end of court propaganda and tend to omit from their discussion passages and those texts that point towards the Republican dimension of political ideology, or even go so far as to quote passages in which legitimacy of imperial rule is drawn from the people to support a view that it was bestowed by God. No scholar is playing fast and loose with the evidence here, in part because no one seems to be aware that there are in fact alternatives in play here. Rather, the theological bias is so ingrained in the field that we assume that all texts must be saying the same thing, namely what we have all instructed each other to see through sheer repetition. There is a general bias that also permeates the study of Byzantine religion in favor of official doctrinal positions as opposed to ideologies that are revealed in social practice or less official sources. That is in part why the study of religion in Byzantium is identical with the study of orthodoxy, and why anthropology has made so little headway. We tend to privilege what the Byzantines profess to believe over what they actually did. And second, talks about like a gap between their theories of Byzantine ideology and how the Byzantines actually believed as historical agents. It talks about like if the emperor's legitimacy was theological, if, as Cyril Mango flatly stated, quote, not only did God ordain the existence of the empire, he also chose each individual emperor, which is why no human rules were formulated for his appointment, end quote. And also, if the Byzantines were as orthodox as we have been led to believe, then how is it that they not only criticized their emperors so virulently, and so commonly sang offensive songs about them in public, and plotted against them, but also rebelled against them, or joined rebellions against them, and then killed them or blinded them, without seeming to remember God or his ordinations at such times? Why was tenure of the throne so fragile? This fact is rarely mentioned in the studies of the imperial office and system of Byzantium, an omission that enables the illusion of the alleged dominant ideology. And it goes on to talk about like how it's not surprising, consequently, that no one's been able to explain the turbulence of Byzantine politics on the basis of the imperial, or quote, imperial ideology, end quote. How political history is recounted pragmatically in modern scholarship. Talking about dynamic of power and pragmatism are culturally specific in most other fields, but not in how we write Byzantine history, because of our chosen model of, quote, ideology, end quote. Has nothing to say about the actual operation of the political sphere, leaving us each at the mercy of his own intuitions about how power worked. I think I'll stop there. But that's kind of what I'm saying, like, whether there ever was such an idea, right, of divine right of kings and all that, which obviously I resist all that. So I don't think that you should define the Christian nation, like, of America based on this, right, because it's not what it is, right? That's why I pick up these books to try to understand, like, the problems are with your understanding, and that there's no reason to even entertain the idea of monarchy in my country. I think that'll just empower a man of sin, right? Like, there's no reason for you to believe in this fantasies about monarchy in this country, and I don't believe in this prophecy of a last Byzantine king. You know, you've been wrong about a lot of things, wrong on the Christology. You could be wrong on that. And I found other books, like, I think these are written from a Baptist, these three. I have other ones like it, but found these ones as well. Like, next I was like looking for books that like kind of books are against Imperial theology. Once I found them, like, they're basically, I guess, resistant books, right? Like this one's from, all three of these are from Alan Street. I don't know if he's a Baptist, I don't know. But this one's called Caesar and the Sacrament, Baptism, a Rite of Resistance, right, like this. It shows how Jesus, through his baptism and the apostles being baptized into Jesus' kingdom, is a swearing of allegiance to his order and not the order of the Imperium, order of the Imperial, you know, religion. This one is, what is this? Subversive meals and analysis of the Lord's Supper under Roman domination during the first century, stuff like that. The same thing. They took took the Eucharist as a form of, like, anti-imperial activity. They can be interpreted as being an act against that kind of imperial religion. Songs of Resistance, challenging Caesar and Empire, same author, stuff like that. Obviously, those are, I guess, these like songs. A lyrical prologue, Mary's song. In the beginning was the song, right? Like songs, music, maybe liturgy, right? New Testament songs and stuff like that. Like, all kept within the context of a dissenting context that keeps you separate from the religion of the Imperium, which America doesn't have and doesn't need that. This one's called Christendom and its Discontents. It's edited by Scott L. Wall, if I said that correctly, and Peter D. Dial. What is this? I guess this is about exclusion, persecution, and rebellion from 1000 to 1500. It's a bunch of essays from different contributors, like this. And it goes over the good, but also mainly the bad about Christendom. But sorry, my video is kind of getting long, so I think I'll just stop it there. Just in the back, right? This is from the 11th century onward. Latin Christendom was torn by discontent and controversy as the church and secular rulers defined more clearly than ever before the laws and institutions on which they based their power. They demanded greater uniformity and obedience to their authority. Under increasing pressure to conform to the prevailing orthodoxies, minorities and dissenters struggled to define themselves and to survive. The resulting tensions led to outright challenges to the church and the repression of any group that could be branded as heretic or deviant. The essays in this book cast new light on the dynamics of repression, highlighting the controversies and discontent that troubled medieval society, looking especially at the mechanisms underlying the dissemination of heterodoxy and its repression, the religious aspirations of women, the fate of non-Christian minorities in Europe, and changing boundaries between orthodoxy and heterodoxy. The authors provide a new understanding of the Church's response to the diversity of belief and practice in which it was confronted. So anyway, so hopefully the books interest you, right? Hopefully I spoke clearly. But anyway, I'll just end it there. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.